Bună seara și bine ați venit, bine ați revenit. Am putea să spunem că ne-am întâlnit pentru lansarea unei cărți, dar odată ce m-am uitat și am văzut un public avizat și curios, suntem cumva între prieteni și de asta, ca să citesc din carte, Speranță în aer, suntem aici astăzi să eficientizăm discuțiile climatice care ne fac să ne simțim neputincioși. Pentru că am descoperit în aceste câteva zile în domnul Tim Flannery un optimist și vorbim de soluții, cuvânt puternic pe care invitatul nostru de astăzi îl rostește încă din subtitlul cărții, și vorbim și de instrumente dezvoltate cu scopul evitării unui dezastru climatic. Și pentru că am avut deja 3 conferințe, fiecare pentru publicul corespunzător, astăzi avem ocazia să punem întrebări. Și pentru asta ați primit deja carnețelele, nu întâmplător ați primit acele carnețele de note bune. Sunt făcute din ștraifurile, din resturile care rămân, margini care de obicei se aruncă din coperte după ce e tipărit. Un tiraj întreg înseamnă o cantitate enormă, pe care le-am transformat în carnețele. Vă notați întrebările, le adunăm și le va primi domnul Flannery și ne va și răspunde astăzi. Și vrem înainte să mulțumim câtorva oameni pentru că sunt astăzi aici. Și cartea asta e cu totul deosebită pentru că este o carte imprimată cu grijă. Totul este ecologic, de la grafică, și mulțumim Arta Grafică. Editura Seneca a avut grijă, inclusiv, cum v-am spus, și ștraifurile, să nu fie niște resturi, să nu se arunce. Și agenția care ne-a ajutat foarte mult și toată lumea. Și bine ați venit în această seară. O să îi dau cuvântul domnului Flannery ca să ne vorbească și apoi să aștepte întrebările noastre.
Thank you very much for that great introduction. Is this working now? Is okay? Right, thank you. Good. Well, where to begin? My goodness, the last week for me is the first time I've ever visited Romania, and it feels like a lifetime ago that I was ever anywhere else. It has been an extraordinary learning experience for me being in this country. Not least of which is coming to this extraordinary Anticafe. I'd heard about Seneca Publishing before coming here, obviously. They published my book and invited me to come on this tour. And for that I'm immensely grateful. I really am, to all of the people involved in that. But this place here has taught me a lot. You know, I read Seneca. I've read his works. I know he was a great Stoic philosopher. But the importance and immediate relevance of his work in the modern era hadn't really come home to me till I visited this cafe. And it is so much about that central idea of taking responsibility in your own actions. You know, be the change, as Gandhi said. It is central to all of the good things that we need to do, all of the important things that we need to do in coming months. So for me, this cafe is the embodiment of a philosophy that is absolutely central to our sustainable future. And to discover this here in Bucharest was a real surprise. We don't have an Anticafe in Melbourne or Sydney, where I come from. This is a really interesting experiment. So it's great to be here speaking to you from this particular platform. The book that I'm launching this evening is called Atmosphere of Hope. I wrote it nearly 3 years ago now, after a period of very deep hopelessness for me. I've been involved with climate change activism, trying to get change now for over 20 years. I've been a climate commissioner in my own country of Australia. I ran the Copenhagen Climate Council on behalf of the Danish government for business engagement in the lead up to the Copenhagen meeting. And all of that took a fair bit of energy. And I must say, we came to Copenhagen full of hope that finally we would get a global deal brokered. Yeah, so the reason that I was really overtaken by hopelessness was that all of the hard work that we'd done for 3 years with the Copenhagen Climate Council, all of the preparation for government. All of our hopes for a global treaty came to nothing. They were destroyed by forces of opposition that produced the ClimateGate scandal and that just made it impossible for us to move forward. And for a couple of years after that, I thought, I'll do what I can in Australia, but what hope is there globally? And it was only around about 2013 that I started to see real cause for hope. I had become involved with Sir Richard Branson and his Virgin Earth Challenge, and by 2013 we started to see some applications to the Earth Challenge that were capable of really starting to solve this climate problem. The challenge, incidentally, is about drawing carbon from the atmosphere, so that was good. We were also seeing for the first time the rate of emissions growth starting to flatten out. And so I thought, perhaps I need to shed this hopelessness and write a new book really investigating where the hope lies. So that's the origin of the book we're launching this evening. So I argued in Atmosphere of Hope that we needed to do two things. First, to cut our dependence on fossil fuels as hard and fast as humanly possible. But secondly, to start drawing some CO2 out of the atmosphere at a scale that would make a difference to our climate. Because if we couldn't do both of those things, or at least start to draw the CO2 out at the same time we cut, I couldn't see how we would stay below 2 degrees of warming, how we would stay safe from climate change, dangerous climate change. So where are we now in April of 2017? I think that we are still perched on the knife edge. Yes, we have started to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. So for the last 3 years, emissions have flatlined while economic growth has continued. That is fantastic news in that we now have decoupled fossil fuel use from economic growth. But at the same time, the consequences of our changing climate have become shockingly severe. I ask you to Google Arctic ice and just watch the relentless decay of the Arctic ice cap. You'll see that before too long we will lose that northern polar ice cap that's been a feature of our planet for millions of years. And just read, again, Google Great Barrier Reef and see what comes up. You know, my home country of Australia is home to the Great Barrier Reef, the largest living organism on our planet, a vast coral area, half the size of Germany. 2 days ago, some of the leading experts on coral ecology said that the Great Barrier Reef was in its terminal phase. Now there is no hope, really, for recovery of that reef. I always knew that the reef was vulnerable to climate change, but I thought maybe we had till 2030, 2040, 2050 before the reef would be in this state, giving us time to make the adjustments we need to save the reef. I now see that that's wrong. And in fact, we are right in the middle of a very grave crisis of life on Earth. On a beautiful spring day here in Bucharest, all of that might seem impossible and distant and not relevant. But can I assure you that everything on this earth is interconnected with everything else? We cannot destroy something as large as the Great Barrier Reef and hope there will be no consequences. There will be consequences for everyone of the changes that we're seeing. And you know, we've had so many warnings, so many opportunities to change things. If we had begun in 1992 with the Rio Earth Summit, when George Bush Sr. said, yes, let's take action to protect the environment, we would have had an easy run to avoid this climate crisis. Even if we'd done something in Copenhagen 2009, it would have been possible to deal with the climate crisis just by cutting the use of fossil fuels. By the time of the Paris meeting, it wasn't possible to do it just by cutting fossil fuels. We needed technologies to pull CO2 out of the air to succeed. And I greatly fear that if we don't act over the next decade, even that last opportunity may be lost. and the problem will become so large that there'll be no feasible means of dealing with the problem. And this generation right now has great assets that earlier generations didn't have. We have affordable clean energy technologies for the first time just in the last few years. We can see the glimmerings of opportunity for whole new industries based on carbon negative technologies. And we have before our eyes the very evidence, the real evidence of how profound this crisis is. So I think we can prevail. We can prevail, but we need to understand that we are all in this together. So when you read about the Australian government building another huge coal mine, you should be outraged as Romanians that our government is doing such stupid things. For me, coming here to Romania, I must say that I'm upset when I see a sort of apathy in some people, a sense that, oh, it's so hard to change things. Yes, it's hard, but we must rise to the challenge. We are all individually responsible for this, and if we leave it too long, it will be too late. So let's shed our apathy. Let's do what the people who've put the Seneca Anticafe together, do what they have done, which is to show real leadership in their life. And when I say leadership, I don't mean becoming president or prime minister. What I mean is that you should lead in your own circle. So if you're in a business, show leadership in terms of concern for sustainability. If you're in a social group, try to work with others to make a more sustainable future. If you're part of government or you're interested in politics, the same thing. Be the change, be a leader in your community in the small things, or what may appear to be small to you, but when multiplied 7.4 billion times, will make a huge difference. I think we need to leave behind the 20th century and 20th century way of doing things and help give birth to a new 21st century way of doing things, which will entail a whole new economy based around carbon negative technologies, clean energy, and ever greater interconnectedness. You know, by 2050, the climate crisis will be in full swing. The decisions will have been made by then. And we will have either fostered the technologies we need to save our planet from warming, or we will have failed. 2050 is just 33 years away. And 33 years might seem like a long time. But let's look back on the 20th century to see what happened over the 30-year period, 33 years from 1917 to 1950. You know, if you were living here in Bucharest in 1917 and wanted to go anywhere very far, you probably took a horse and a cart. If you wanted to wash your clothes or do anything around the house, you probably did it by hand. There was no electrical goods in the place. And when you went to school, you would have studied ancient maps of now vanished empires, but those maps would have seemed like they would never change. By 1950, here in Bucharest, you would have known all about jet aircraft, nuclear weapons, electrification in the home, motor vehicles, many other things. So that 33 years brought huge change that was almost inconceivable to people living in 1917. I think that this century will bring equivalent changes. It's just that they'll be larger and even faster. Of course, it all depends upon us people. And I can imagine some of you in the audience might look and say, oh, there's that Aussie guy, that Australian up there. It's easy for him because he's from a developed country and it's just somehow easier in Australia. Let me tell you that it isn't. It's really, really hard everywhere. And besides, Australia and Romania, yes, there are plenty of differences, but there are some very striking similarities. We both have a population of around 20 million people. We are both so lucky to live in countries which are some of the most naturally beautiful on the face of our planet. And we're both isolated to some extent. Australia by geographic isolation, Romania by language and perhaps accidents of history. I do feel a strange kinship with this country and its people. I think there are real similarities. So I hope that we can continue to work together to achieve what may seem like a very big goal, but if we take it one step at a time, I'm confident we'll get there. Thank you very much. Education has probably been the biggest part of my life, and that going out to schools and talking to children has been a very important part of that for me. And I think the most successful programs I've seen are those that engage very small children in some simple activities that give them a love for nature. So even making a small garden bed, looking at the bugs with a magnifying glass on the plants, listening to the birds, identifying the trees and telling the children what they are, gives them gives them some foundation and some love for nature in their hearts. And that is essential, because without that love, they don't know what they will stand to lose. So I think for very little kids, that's a good thing to do. As they get older and start to understand that their parents aren't gods, in fact they are flawed human beings, we can take some other strategies. And then I think it's very good to challenge them a little bit and to say, okay, here's our electricity bill. How can you make it better? How can you save us some money? I'll give you the savings in pocket money, but you start saving the electricity, yeah? So empower them, yeah? Just telling people there's a disaster coming is not always the best thing, especially young people like that. So I would tend to empower them to say, you can be the change we need to see. Even older kids who are thinking about their future career, I think it's really important there that we expose them to all of the opportunities that exist. So yes, they need to understand the threat and the urgency, but they also need to understand how they, as a future entrepreneur or business person or politician or social worker or economist or whatever it is, can contribute to a new and better society. I just think it's so true what Margaret Mead said all those years ago. And Margaret Mead was an anthropologist. She said, never doubt that a few good people can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. So if we can generate among those young minds a few good people, a few Elon Musks, a few, you know, Al Gores, whoever else you want, we have done a great thing. So I think the education process needs to be something like that. The tide of history is on our side, and there will always be pushback. Now, it may seem that the President of the United States can do anything he wants, but the reality is that in the US, clean energy technologies are now cheaper than most fossil fuel technologies. And there are enormous industries in the United States, in places like California, that are built on those clean energy technologies. So I think that Donald Trump, you know, he may be able to disadvantage America a little bit by subsidising antique industries like coal mining and doing away with environmental regulation in ways that actually damages industry and damages the environment. But nobody wants that in the longer term. I think that's a short-term blip. I can't believe that we won't have a pushback from those forces in the United States that want a better future. So I think history's on our side. The big issue is how fast we can move. And that's why we need to mobilise now and do what we can, because you know, it would be so easy just to say it's all lost, that it's hopeless. That's the lazy man's option. We can't afford to be lazy at this moment in history. Well, look, I really do think that in the medium term, the biggest threat is climate change, is this increasing temperature. Its impacts are going to be, they'll affect every aspect of our lives, really will, because what we are doing is interfering with the metabolism of the planet. And we can see the consequences. You know, we can see the Arctic ice melting away. We can see the northern forests dying in a huge scale due to pine bark beetle infestation, which is caused by the warming. In my own country of Australia, the barrier reef is dying now. We are having heat waves that kill hundreds of people in Australia. You know, increasing heat waves are the biggest killer in my country, biggest natural killer in my country. We're seeing rising oceans, depleting biodiversity, threats to food production, threats to fisheries. The list just goes on and on and on. And if we let those incremental changes continue to accumulate, the stability of our civilization will be under threat. So for me, there's no question that that is the biggest threat. Now, I know that there are other things people would probably talk about, like politics, corrupt political systems. Yes, hugely important. War, yes. Famine in Africa, disadvantage for women in developing countries. All of those things are hugely, hugely important. But as a systemic change, I don't think there's anything much bigger than climate change. I think when I look around the world at projects or programs that have really worked in terms of reducing emissions, they fall into a couple of categories. So let me start with the most future of them, which is really increased funding for innovation, technological innovation. That is such a central thing, to develop our clean industries faster and develop new industries. Very, very important. We also need to hasten the deployment of clean energy technologies and hasten the efficiency measures in existing industries. And to do that, you need some financing from government, preferably loans. So you need something like a Clean Energy Finance Corporation or a green bank that makes those loans. So those two things are important. In addition to that, you need targets. Governments need to set targets to where they want to be. Otherwise, you don't know where you're heading. And the Paris Agreement has helped us with that, yeah? Maybe, well, we've been asked to set targets, but maybe they're insufficient, yes, but they're a target, yeah? Now, you may need additional measures to reach those targets. You may need a carbon tax. Places like British Columbia in Canada have had a very successful carbon tax now, which is directly offset by income tax reductions for many years, a decade or more. You may need an emissions trading scheme. China is now experimenting with an emissions trading scheme. There's been one in Europe for many years. You may need some sort of feed-in tariff or some sort of sectoral carbon price that allows the preferential uptake of green energy. There are many, many options, and their suitability very much depends upon where you are and what your challenge is. So, but for me, the two indispensable ones are innovation and clean energy financing. They're the two that are really, really, they have been so effective where they've been used. They're at scale. And I'm talking here about billions of dollars in those funds, big scale.
And what about restricting consumption?
I don't think you can force people to restrict consumption. You can make it more attractive to consume less by having, you know, star ratings on goods. You can offer subsidies to people to do that sort of thing. But I don't think the Big Brother approach works very well. In fact, what we really need to do to solve many of our problems is treat people like adults, not like children. So as adults, we have to get them to make the choices, yeah? And I think they're much more enduring if you do it yourself. I was at the American school late last week, and the children were asking questions, and one tiny little boy, maybe 6 years old, put his hand up, and his dad was saying, shh, 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 don't ask, you know. But he persisted, and I said, yes, what is your question? And he said, what is a politician? Which is such a great question. And I've been thinking about it ever since, been thinking about the answer. And, you know, I think politics can play a very powerful role in this. But it depends what we mean by politics and what we mean by being a politician. You know, if we live in a system where there is a strong man that we look up to, you know, the Russian model, if you want, people behave like children. They never have to make decisions. They are never faced with the consequences of their actions. And you end up in a system which is hopelessly paralysed, I think. But if you take perhaps a system a bit more like Switzerland, where people are actively involved all the time in decision making, they take responsibilities for their own actions, and they really behave like adults rather than children, you know. And so what I really hope is that in answering that little boy's question, we can all become politicians, all become involved. We need to take some power back from our elected representatives in some way so that we become part of the decision-making process. The best societies are those where all of us learn to rule and be ruled by turn, because we end up knowing what it's like. There are political models for doing this, and I was just in your Parliament building this afternoon talking to a group of 43 new young parliamentarians who are trying to investigate new models of governance, models that involve asking their constituents what are the right answers to these questions, not just through a referendum, but through a deep interrogation, a jury system where people can really do a deep dive into an issue and come up with an answer that reflects a societal view. So that's my hope.
The politician in each of us.
Each of us needs to be a politician. And you know, in times past, of course, we were all politicians. In a tribal society like the societies of New Guinea that I've worked in, everyone is not only a politician, they are a teacher of their own children, they're their own carpenter, they make their own house, they're their own food provider, they do everything, they're their own soldier, you know. And that was the system that people lived in for many, many years. It's only more recently that we've become very specialised and just do one little thing. So yes, we may run out of vital resources due to overexploitation. We may end up destroying parts of nature through that same economic engine. And they are problems that we need to be aware of, and we can perhaps deal with through regulation or whatever else within the marketplace. And maybe economic growth itself is not sustainable forever. But I think the point I wanted to raise is that we have a very, very urgent issue with emissions. And we have a lot of poor people in developing countries who want a better lifestyle. So we need some growth for them to be able to share a better life. In the past, it looked like a hopeless conundrum that we couldn't give them that without somehow sacrificing something from elsewhere. But now it looks as if we can do that. We've had now 3 years in a row of flat emissions. I'm really hoping that this year will be the year that emissions decline. If it is, then we've gone over that curve and we're heading down the other side. But we have to see about that. So I'm not denying the other problems that we have, but simply pointing out one solitary bit of good news in this story. If you look at the share of electricity generated by nuclear energy in the 1970s compared with 2017, that share has gone down very dramatically from about 18% of world energy at its peak in the 70s through to about, I think, 10 or 11% today. And in terms of absolute numbers of megawatts, the amount of electricity generated by nuclear power has also declined. So why has that happened? First, it has happened because there have been some accidents which have made people nervous of using nuclear power. We can understand that. But secondly, it's happening because the financing and building of nuclear power plants is becoming increasingly difficult and non-economic. So if you want to build a nuclear power plant, the scale has to be around 2,000 megawatts. It usually entails $15, $20 billion to do that. There's probably 10 years of planning, 5 years of construction, and then 50 years until your money is all paid back. So you have locked up $20 billion for 65 years on a bet on the future price of electricity. So people with money look at that and say, that doesn't look like a very good deal to me. But what about wind or solar? Well, both are modular. You can build as many or as few wind turbines as you need for $1 million apiece. And the payback period is only perhaps 15 to 25 years, maybe less for some solar installations. And they're very modular, so I can spend $1 million or $100,000 or $1 billion, depending on my need. And the planning times and construction times are very, very short. So for all of those reasons, financing is flowing into clean energy technologies. Now, being intermittent, those clean energy technologies have their own problems, yeah, which we all know about, and they can be solved, but they will take additional financing and additional technologies to be able to work out how to do this properly. Nuclear power, on the other hand, comes with its own problems. If you have nuclear power, there's no point talking about energy efficiency. The stuff is on 24/7, yeah? So it's a different sort of challenge. So I think that there is a hierarchy of change. What will happen is that we will hopefully phase out coal first. There'll be some gas for some decades. There'll probably be some nuclear for some decades, particularly in places like China, where the government assumes the risk and provides the financing.